There's a particular cruelty in the smell of smoke that won't wash out. I had scrubbed my hair 3 times the morning I left Portland, once with the cheap motel soap that smelled like artificial lavender and false promises, once with the half-empty bottle of someone else's shampoo I found beneath the bathroom sink, and once more simply because I couldn't stop. The water ran gray the first time. The second time it ran clear, but I could still smell it. By the third, I had stopped believing that clean was something I could reach again so quickly. The fire had taken everything on a Tuesday, not metaphorically, not in the loose, poetic way people say everything when they mean a lot. I mean the paintings stacked against the studio wall, 3 years of botanical work, all those careful studies of seed pods and root systems and the way lichen spreads across stone like slow calligraphy. I mean the notebooks, the sketchbooks going back to college, the hard drive I had never gotten around to backing up, sitting on my desk like a small black monument to my own procrastination. I mean the houseplants I had named, which is embarrassing to admit, but becomes less embarrassing when you understand that I had been living alone for 4 years, and the Monstera Deliciosa in the kitchen window was genuinely the most consistent relationship I'd had in that entire time. The firefighters were kind. One of them gave me a foil blanket that made me look like a baked potato and smell like a campfire, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke about my life at that point. A neighbor I had never spoken to stood in the street in her robe and cried for me, which was touching and also deeply alarming. Another neighbor filmed it on his phone, which was neither. Insurance would cover some of it. The structural damage, the contents estimate that would ultimately undervalue everything I'd lost by a wide and insulting margin. But you cannot insure 3 years of work. You cannot file a claim for the specific quality of afternoon light you had finally learned to capture in a botanical illustration. That particular trick with the watercolor where you lift the pigment before it fully dries to suggest the transparency of a petal. Something that had taken me 2 full years to figure out, and that I was now, apparently, supposed to simply remember how to do. I sat in the motel room for 4 days. I ate vending machine food and watched television with the sound off and stared at the water stains on the ceiling in a way that I suspected was not healthy. I called my mother, who immediately suggested I come home to New Hampshire, which would have meant sleeping in my childhood bedroom under the same glow-in-the-dark star stickers I'd put up at age 9, and listening to my stepfather talk about his golf handicap. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I called my agent, who was sympathetic for approximately 4 minutes and then asked, carefully, about the illustrations I owed the botanical press by March. I said I'd be in touch. And then, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th vending machine dinner, I called Zephyrine. We had grown up together in the particular way that small-town proximity manufactures deep friendships. Not because we had chosen each other out of a crowd, but because we had found each other on the edge of one. Both of us slightly too strange for the social machinery of Harpswell, Maine to fully process. She was the girl who drew buildings in her math notebooks, precise elevations and cross-sections at age 13, who seemed to find the geometry of structures more interesting than the geometry of people. I was the girl who pressed flowers between the pages of every book I owned, and once spent an entire summer learning the Latin names of every plant on the peninsula. We had been, for about 12 years, absolutely inseparable. And then life had done what life does. She had gone to study architecture in Boston, then a fellowship in Copenhagen, then a firm in New York that had her name on work in 4 countries before she was 32. I had gone to art school in Providence, then a series of small cities in no particular order, chasing natural light and cheap studio space and the occasional artist residency. We emailed. We texted in bursts. Long strings of messages and then silences that stretched for months and somehow never felt like abandonment. Just the natural rhythm of 2 people whose lives had learned to exist in parallel. The last time I'd seen her in person had been 3 years ago at her father's funeral. We had stood together in the cold at the graveside in a way that didn't require words, and then we'd sat in her rental car in the cemetery parking lot for an hour talking about absolutely nothing important. And it had been, I think, one of the most honest conversations I'd had in years. She answered on the second ring. Thistle. Not a question. Just my name, in that low and careful voice of hers that always sounded like she was measuring something. Hey. My voice came out smaller than I intended. I need somewhere to go. A pause. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the pause of someone running a quiet calculation. I heard about the fire, she said. I've been waiting for you to call. That nearly broke me. Not the sympathy. Sympathy I had been receiving in uncomfortable quantities from people who knew me less well than they thought they did. But the waiting. The quiet certainty that she had known I would call, and had simply held the space open. The house in Acadia, I said. Are you still? Yes. Come whenever you're ready. Another pause, shorter. Come now if you want. I want to say I drove up the coast with something like purpose. I want to say the late November light on the water was restorative, that I rolled the window down despite the cold, and felt something shift in my chest, some loosening of the tightness that had been living there since I'd stood in the street watching my studio burn. I want to say all of that, because it would make a better story. What actually happened was that I got lost twice, because I was too tired to properly read my GPS. Pulled over once to cry in a gas station parking lot in Rockland, ate half a bag of pretzels in the car, and arrived at Zephyrines' house approximately 40 minutes later than I should have, because I had been sitting in the driveway for that long, unable to make myself get out. The house was not what I had expected, which was strange, because I had seen photographs. She had sent me a few over the years, brief architectural documentation with the flatness of professional pride, rather than personal warmth. But photographs had not prepared me for the way it sat in the landscape. It was low and horizontal, as if it had grown out of the granite ledge rather than been placed upon it. Concrete and glass and weathered steel, brutalist in its bones but softened somehow, not by ornament, but by the way its angles met the fog. The cliff fell away behind it toward the ocean, and from where I sat in the driveway I could hear the water even though I couldn't see it, a low and constant percussion against the rocks far below. Spruce trees stood close on the north side, dark and patient. The house seemed to sit between two kinds of time. The geological time of the stone beneath it, and the slower, quieter time of a place that had been built for permanence rather than display. It was beautiful. It was also slightly terrifying. A light was on in what I could see was a long glass-sided room along the south face of the building. I watched a shape move across it, tall and unhurried, and stop, and stay still, looking out at the driveway, looking at me. I got out of the car. She opened the door before I made it up the path. She looked the same, and completely different in the way that 7 years will do to a person. The same height, the same economical way of holding herself. That particular stillness she'd always had that made you feel, talking to her, that you were the only thing in her field of attention, and also that her field of attention had a quality to it that you were not entirely sure you understood. Her hair was shorter now, close-cropped on the sides, longer on top, shot through with early silver at the temples that she wore with the casual indifference of someone who genuinely had not noticed or genuinely did not care, and with Zephyrine it was impossible to tell which. She was wearing charcoal linen trousers and a dark sweater, and she looked like someone who lived in a concrete house on a cliff above the Atlantic Ocean by deliberate choice. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you," I said. "That's genuinely a relief to hear." Something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. She stepped aside to let me in. The entry hall was narrow and high-ceilinged, lit by a single long pendant fixture that cast a warm band of light down the concrete floor. She took my bag without asking and set it beside the stairs. I stood in the middle of the hall and looked at the house and tried not to feel like I had entered someone else's dream. "Have you eaten?" she asked. Define eaten. Consumed food in a quantity sufficient to sustain you. I had pretzels. She looked at me for a moment with that particular expression. Not exactly disapproval, not exactly concern, somewhere between the two that created its own category. Then she turned and walked toward the kitchen, and I followed. The kitchen was the warmest room I had seen yet, which in this context meant it had wooden surfaces and a long concrete island, and a window that faced the water even though it was dark outside, and there was nothing to see but the reflection of the room and ourselves in it. She put a pot on the stove with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular thing many times. Soup, it turned out, something with lentils and root vegetables that smelled like the specific opposite of vending machine food. I sat on a high stool at the island and watched her and didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything either, and it was not uncomfortable. That was the first thing that surprised me. I had braced myself for the awkwardness of a long gap, for the slight stiffness of two people trying to remember how to be around each other. But there was no stiffness. There was just the sound of the stove and the ocean outside, and her moving quietly around the kitchen, and it felt, in some distant way I couldn't fully access yet, like something that had been waiting for me. "The guest room is at the end of the hall on the upper floor," she said, without turning from the stove. "The bathroom is adjacent. There are towels in the cabinet." "Zeph, you don't have to thank me." "I know, but Thistle." She turned then, and looked at me directly, and there was something in it that was both softer and more serious than I'd expected. "You're here. That's what matters." I looked at the counter. My hands were wrapped around a mug she'd set in front of me. Tea, black, which was exactly what I drink, and which she had simply produced without asking, the way you do with someone you have memorized across years. The mug was warm. The kitchen smelled like something real and nourishing. Outside the window, the ocean kept its dark conversation with the rocks. "Tell me about the fire when you're ready," she said. "There's no timeline." "It was stupid," I said. The word came out flat and practiced, which meant it was covering something. "Old wiring. The landlord had been warned twice. It started in the wall of the unit below mine and came up through the floor." I paused. "I was out. I was at the grocery store. I came home and it was already..." Another pause. "I got my phone and my wallet and my coat. That was it." She said nothing. She ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of me, and then leaned against the opposite counter with her own bowl and looked at me with that particular quality of attention that had always made me feel both seen and slightly exposed. "The paintings," I said. "The new series. I know. 3 years, Zeph. I know." The soup was very good. I ate it because my body was making demands my mind wasn't fully tracking, and because eating gave me something to do with my hands that wasn't gripping the mug like it owed me something. She ate too, quietly, and did not offer hollow reassurances or practical suggestions or any of the verbal furniture that people put between themselves and another person's pain. She just stayed in the room with me, which was, I was beginning to remember, one of the specific and rare things about her. The guest room was spare and high and perfect in the cold way that beautiful things sometimes are. A platform bed with white linen, a reading light on a low shelf, a window that filled the entire west wall, and when I woke in the middle of the night, which I did, as I had every night since the fire, I lay in the dark and looked at the shapes of spruce trees against the gray-black sky, and listened to the ocean, and something in me recognized that this was not the same as the motel ceiling, not the same as the tight fluorescent silence of disaster. This was something else. Quieter, more deliberate. I slept until 7, which was more than I had managed in days. Zephyrine was already at work when I came downstairs. Through the long glass wall of her studio, which occupied the entire south wing, I could see now in daylight, a long, open room full of drafting tables and model-making surfaces, and the organized geometry of a mind that worked in 3 dimensions. I could see her standing at a large work table, studying something with her hands braced on the surface and her head slightly bowed. She did not look up as I passed. I made coffee in the kitchen, which took longer than it should have because her coffee setup was the kind that involved a specific grinder and a specific pour-over process. And I spent 5 minutes studying the arrangement of equipment the way you might study an instruction manual in a foreign language. Eventually, I arrived at something that smelled like coffee, and I stood at the kitchen window with it and looked at the ocean for the first time in full light. It was extraordinary. The cliff dropped maybe 30 feet to a narrow shelf of rock, and then the water took over completely, gray-green and restless, under a sky that hadn't made up its mind yet, fog still hanging in the spruce trees on the point to the north. The light was the particular quality of Maine coastal light in November that I had forgotten existed. Not warm, not bright, but full, carrying with it a kind of clarity that the summer months, with their softer haze, don't have. Everything was edges. The granite, the waterline, the spruce against the sky. My hands itched. Not literally, or not just literally, but in the specific way that used to mean I needed a pencil, a brush, a surface, in the way that had been silent for weeks. I stood there with my coffee and the itching in my hands and thought, "Oh, so you're still in there somewhere." She appeared in the kitchen doorway at 10, precise as a timekeeper. "Good morning." No preamble, no checking whether I'd slept well. "Morning. Your coffee situation is... There's a card on the counter." I looked. There was, in fact, a small index card propped against the grinder, with a neat diagram of the pour-over process in her exact spare handwriting. I had somehow missed it entirely. "Oh." The grind setting is marked. 40 grams, 210 degrees, 3-minute total brew. I got something in the approximate vicinity of that. I know. It smelled acceptable. She poured herself a cup using the process I had clumsily approximated, and then stood with it at the opposite end of the kitchen island. In the morning light, she looked different than she had the night before. Less like a shape in the fog and more like a specific person, which sounds strange but is exactly the right description. More angular, more present, more her, in a way I hadn't fully registered the night before, because I had been too undone to register much beyond shelter and soup. "I want to talk to you about the house," she said. Something tightened in my chest before I could stop it. "Okay." Nothing alarming. She set her mug down and looked at me with that clear, measuring expression. I work here. It's my primary workspace, not just where I sleep. I need certain things to be consistent." "Of course." I meant it. "Tell me." "The studio is closed from 7 to 2, she said. "That's my deep work window. No interruptions. Not for emergencies unless something is on fire." A brief pause. "I'm sorry. That was a poor choice of words." "It's fine," I said. "It's already a word. You can keep using it." She looked at me for a moment with something that might have been relief, or might have been appreciation, and then continued. "After 2, I'm generally available. Evenings are variable. I sometimes work late, sometimes not. The common areas are shared. Kitchen, the east sitting room, the terrace if you want it. The studio is mine." She paused. "Not because I don't trust you. Because I can't work with another person in the room. I've tried. It doesn't work." Understood completely. "There's a path down to the water, the north side of the house, through the spruce trees. There's a door in the wall, and a set of cut steps in the granite. The lower shelf is accessible at mid-tide or below. I'd check the tide table before you go." She pushed a laminated card across the island toward me. "Monthly tide times," printed in her small, neat numbers. "And there are coats in the hall closet. Your coat is inadequate for Maine in November, yes, I'm aware. There's a Grundens in there that will fit you well enough. It's yellow, which I understand may be objectionable. I'll manage." Something moved across her face again, that almost smile, the one that didn't quite arrive but altered the whole landscape of her expression in the process. She picked up her coffee. "I have calls this afternoon," she said. but we could eat dinner together if you want." "I want," I said, immediately. Maybe too immediately. She nodded, once, and disappeared back into the studio. I should explain something about Zephyrine, for the sake of honesty, because the way I am describing her probably suggests someone cold, or withholding, or difficult, and she isn't any of those things, or she isn't only those things. The economy of her manner is not unfriendliness. It's more like a very precise instrument. She doesn't waste words, but the words she uses land exactly where she means them to. She doesn't perform warmth, but the warmth is there if you know where to look for it. In the coffee diagram left on the counter, in the tide card she had laminated and kept on the island for a guest she hadn't yet had, in the fact that she had a soup already made when I arrived, as if she'd been expecting me before I called. We had been close once, in the loose and uncomplicated way of children, who find each other's company simply preferable to other options. And then time had passed and we had grown into the shapes of our separate adult lives. And the last few years of emails and text messages had been warm but thin. The way a conversation can be warm without being full. I had not known until I arrived whether the version of her I remembered was still the version I would find. She was different. I knew that within the first hour. The teenage Zephyrine had been contained, but not closed, had laughed easily at the right things, had been capable of a certain passionate intensity about buildings and materials and structural systems that had always charmed me because it was so complete and specific. This version still had the containment, still had the precision. But there was something else in it now that I couldn't name yet. A layer of glass over something I couldn't see through clearly. Not sadness, not coldness. Something more like deliberate distance, like someone who had learned to need very little and now lived by that learning. It interested me, which is perhaps already a problem, though I didn't recognize it as one yet. The days arranged themselves around her schedule in a way that suited me more than I expected. In the mornings, while she worked, I walked. The path through the spruce trees was exactly where she'd said. A narrow track through roots and stone that opened at a heavy wooden door set into a low granite wall. Beyond that, cut steps that were old enough to have been worn smooth at their centers, descending past lichen-covered rock face to the ledge below. The first time I went down, I stood at the waterline for a long time and did nothing more than breathe. The geology here was extraordinary. The granite was pink and gray and almost salmon in the low light, veined with darker intrusions, cracked and polished by the long argument between rock and sea. In the tide pools, shallow depressions cupped in the stone like an architect's drawings of something. There was life of extraordinary specificity. Periwinkles and dog whelks and the bright orange of sea stars, colonies of barnacles arranged in their fractal geometry, the dark green ruffle of rockweed lifting and settling in the wash of passing swells. I started sketching on the third day. Just rough drawings, not proper botanical work. Pencil in a new notebook I'd bought at a hardware store in Bar Harbor. The only kind that was available, lined rather than blank, which I turned sideways and used accordingly. The drawings were terrible, clumsy and uncertain, and nothing like the work I had lost. But my hands were moving, which was something, which was, in the current context, a significant thing. I didn't show them to Zephyrine. I wasn't ready to talk about the work, or the absence of it, or the specific grief of losing something that existed in no other copy anywhere in the world. And she didn't ask. What she did was this. She left a new sketchbook on the kitchen island on the fourth morning. Large format, heavyweight paper, the specific brand I had used in art school. No note, just the sketchbook, positioned where I would find it with my coffee. I stood there and looked at it for a while. Then I took it and my coffee outside to the terrace, and sat in the cold with the blanket she had also left on the terrace chair, and drew the shape of the spruce trees against the November sky, until my hands went stiff. Dinner was the hour I looked forward to most, which surprised me because I am not generally a person who organizes my day around meals. But dinner at Zephyrines' house was something specific. She cooked with the same precision she brought to everything, not elaborately, not performatively, but correctly, in the sense of things done with the right attention and the right amount of time. We ate at the long table in the kitchen, which looked out through a window toward the dark water, and we talked. Or, more accurately, we began to talk. The first few evenings were careful in the way of people who have known each other well and are now negotiating a new version of that knowledge. We talked about her work in generalities, about a commission she had in Iceland, and the structural challenges of building in volcanic soil. We talked about the botanical press and my contract, and the March deadline in terms I kept deliberately flat and light. We talked about her father, a little, in the way you can talk about grief once it has had a few years to find its shape. On the 5th evening, she asked about the sketchbook. "You don't have to tell me," she said, "but I notice you've been taking it to the water." "I have." "How is it?" I looked at the table for a moment. It's like learning to write again after breaking your hand. The knowledge is still there somewhere, but the connection between knowing and doing is severed or stretched. Something. She considered this. She had a habit when considering something of going very still. The kind of stillness that looks like disengagement but is actually the opposite, is actually the most engaged she gets. I had forgotten this. Seeing it again was like finding a word you'd lost. "Does drawing from direct observation help?" she said. "Versus drawing from memory?" "Yes. Memory is where I get into trouble. Everything I remember looks like everything I've lost." She nodded slowly. "Then draw what's here, not what you know." It was simple advice, and I already knew it. The way you know things that still don't work until someone else says them. But something about hearing it from her, in that quiet declarative way, landed differently than it would have from anyone else. "There's a greenhouse," she said, "behind the north wall. I haven't told you about it because it's in a state, but it's there. The previous owner built it. I use it for... well, I don't use it, really. I've kept the heat on. The plants are feral." I looked up. "You can use it," she said, "if you want a more controlled environment." I did not immediately say yes, because something about the way she offered things, without expectation, without emphasis, made you want to match her register. So I said, "Can I see it first?" Something shifted in her face. "Of course." The greenhouse was attached to the north side of the house by a short glass corridor I had taken for a utility passage and never explored. It was maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide, Victorian in structure despite being attached to a brutalist building, an incongruity that should have looked absurd and somehow looked entirely right, as if the two buildings were having a slow and productive argument about time. Inside, chaos, in the specific and beautiful way that happens when plants are given heat and water and no instruction. The original planting had been orderly. You could see the ghost of beds and rows. But several seasons of benign neglect had turned it into something more honest. Ferns had gone epiphytic, climbing the iron supports. A climbing hydrangea had taken over most of the east wall and shed its winter exfoliation in long, papery curls across the flagstone floor. There were pots of what I eventually identified as an Echeveria colony that had reproduced itself to the edges of its shelf and beyond, small rosettes colonizing the floor around it in a slow cascade. And at the far end, almost hidden behind a stand of ornamental grasses gone to winter straw, there was a Monstera deliciosa, so large it had split its original pot and was in the process of rooting itself directly into the seam between two flagstones. I stood in front of it for a long time. "She's a survivor," Zephyrine said, from somewhere behind me. "She," I repeated. "I assume. She's been here since I bought the place. I've done nothing for her, and she continues to do all of this." She gestured at the plant's extravagant reach. I respect that in someone. I turned to look at her. She was standing in the corridor entrance with her hands in her pockets, and the late afternoon light through the glass was doing something unfair to the angles of her face. "I'll name her Persephone," I said, obviously. I turned back to the plant. One of its aerial roots had found the crack in the flagstone and driven itself down into it with the quiet, inexorable force of something that has decided where it belongs. "Draw what's here," she had said. "Not what you know." My hands were already itching. The rules of the house settled into a rhythm I hadn't anticipated needing, but found myself grateful for. Mornings were mine and hers, separately. She in the studio, I in the greenhouse or on the rocks below, or at the kitchen table with the oversized sketchbook and a cup of her precise coffee. The silence between 7 and 2 had a quality to it that I hadn't experienced since a residency in Vermont years ago. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of adjacent concentration. Two people in the same building doing separate work, and something in that proximity had, I discovered, a generative warmth. I worked better here than I had worked in years, even accounting for the fact that worked currently meant fumbling towards something I couldn't quite reach yet. She would emerge at 2, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, and she would make tea. She drank tea in the afternoons, not coffee, green tea that she brewed with the same attention she gave the pour-over. And she would stand in the kitchen and look at the ocean and decompress in a way that I slowly learned not to interrupt. Not because she'd told me to, but because I could see what it was and respect it. The studio door closed, the shoulders shifted, something released. After that, we might work in the same room for an hour, her reading drawings or sending emails, me sketching, a coexistence that required nothing of either of us. Or we might walk down to the water if the tide was right. Or she might have calls, and I would take myself off to the greenhouse with the earbuds I never actually used. And then dinner. Every evening, without fail. She was teaching me, I realized, without stating it as instruction, how to be in her house. The rules weren't arbitrary. They protected something real, something she'd built here with deliberate intention. And what I found, inhabiting the edges of that intention, was that there was more room in it than I'd expected. She'd made room. It was on the 9th day that I found the documents. This is not as sinister as it sounds. I wasn't searching. I was looking for a stapler. The east sitting room served as a kind of secondary workspace, or overflow space, I thought, the place where non-urgent things landed. There were architectural books stacked on the side table, samples of concrete aggregate in small labeled jars on the windowsill, a drafting ruler that had been left across the arm of the chair with the absent-mindedness of someone who'd been reading with it. The shelving unit along the inner wall held mostly books, but also a row of large flat folders in different colors, the kind used for drawing storage, and at the far end of the bottom shelf, neither hidden nor prominently displayed, a manila folder that had been set there with more deliberateness than it appeared. I was reaching past it for the stapler I had spotted on the shelf above, when the folder shifted as I moved it, and several loose sheets slid out across the floor. I gathered them up. I was not trying to read them. But words have a way of arriving in the periphery whether you invite them or not, and what arrived in mine before I had time to look away was this: Acadia Coastal Preservation Initiative, and proposed site development, and 3.7 acres, current zoning, and the address of this house. I stacked the papers neatly and put them back in the folder. I put the folder back where it had been. I found the stapler, and did not, in the end, need it for whatever I had originally wanted it for. For the rest of the afternoon, I sat in the greenhouse with Persephone and tried not to think about what I had seen. I failed at this. The thing is, I did not know what it meant. I knew the words. Site development. Proposed. But Zephyrine was an architect. Site development was the vocabulary of her entire professional life. The address could mean anything. A consulting project. A preservation assessment. Something she'd been asked to review by someone else entirely. It could mean anything. But there had been other things I hadn't fully registered until I started registering them. The calls she took in the studio with the door not quite closed. I heard her voice but not the words, which was fine. Privacy is privacy. But there were several of them in the past week that had lasted well into the evening, and once I had passed the studio door and heard a tone in her voice that was different from the calm analytical register she used for client work. Faster, lower, something almost taut in it. The way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the mornings, looking at the landscape with an expression that was harder to read than her usual. I had noticed these things, and filed them under "she is busy and works hard," and I don't know her daily life well enough to read her moods accurately, and both of those things remained true. But now there was a folder on a shelf with an address that was this address, and I had not seen it before I came, and I did not know why it was here. I told myself to leave it alone. She would tell me if there was something to tell. She had not lied to me. Not ever. Not in any version of our friendship I could access. She was not someone who lied, but she was someone who could keep a silence for a very long time. Dinner that evening was quiet in a different way than usual. Not uncomfortable, not strained. She seemed the same, which was unsettling in retrospect because I couldn't tell if that meant there was nothing to be unsettled by, or if it simply meant she was not the kind of person whose face betrayed things she wasn't ready to share. I ate, and I listened to her talk about the Iceland project, and I made the appropriate responses. And when she asked me how the greenhouse work was going, I said honestly that I had drawn the monstera for 2 hours, and it was beginning to feel like something. Beginning to feel like something, she repeated. Not a question. More like she was testing the weight of the phrase. Like it might become work, I said, rather than just movement. Good. She looked at me for a moment with those clear, measuring eyes. There's a quality in your drawings. The ones in the sketchbook. I saw a few pages when it was open on the table. She paused. I wasn't looking. I just saw. I know. I leave it open because I can't bear to close it on the drawings yet. It's a superstition. The quality is... She stopped. Considered. You draw like you're in conversation with the plant, not describing it, talking back to it. Something in my chest did something uncharacteristic at that. That's exactly what it feels like, I said, from the inside. She looked at her plate. Then she said, very quietly, I've missed that. Watching you work. I looked at her. She was not looking at me, and her face was doing something that I couldn't read, and there was a silence that lasted maybe 4 seconds, but had the weight of something much longer. I've missed working near you, I said, because it was true, and because it was the version of the true thing I could say without the full weight of what I actually meant landing between us on the table. She nodded. She got up to clear the dishes. I watched her from where I sat and thought about the folder on the shelf, and thought about the quality of her voice on those evening phone calls, and thought about the fact that I had been here 9 days, and it already felt, in some part of me, I was trying not to examine too closely, like the first place I had wanted to stay in a very long time. That was not a comfortable thought. That was, if I was being honest, a slightly dangerous one. But the ocean kept going outside the window, and she kept moving around the kitchen in her quiet, efficient way, and the spruce trees were dark shapes against a sky going purple at the horizon, and I sat with the thought and did not run from it. Not yet. On the 11th day, it rained. Not the bracing coastal drizzle I had been walking in all week, but proper rain. The kind that arrives from the southwest with a pressure change you feel in your sternum before you hear it. Horizontal against the glass and relentless. The sea was pewter and churned, and the cliff was invisible in the downpour. We were both, for the first time, entirely housebound. She worked until 2 anyway. I drew in the greenhouse, which drummed with the rain against its glass roof, in a sound that was unexpectedly hypnotic, and I filled 6 pages of the large sketchbook with close studies of Echeveria rosettes, which are a botanical illustrator's particular pleasure, because they operate on the same principle as the Fibonacci sequence expressed in living material, each leaf placed at exactly 137.5 degrees from the last, a golden angle, geometry that predates geometry. At 2, she appeared in the doorway of the greenhouse with 2 mugs. "Tea," she said. We sat on the low bench against the south wall of the greenhouse and drank the tea and listened to the rain and did not immediately talk, which was its own kind of conversation. Outside the glass, the world was gray and close and completely undifferentiated. Inside was the smell of living things and warm, damp soil and the faint mineral smell of the flagstone. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," she said. She said it the way you might say it after 11 days of building toward it, which is to say plainly, without apology, as if it were a natural extension of the silence rather than an interruption of it. I thought about it. I don't think the work will ever be the same. The illustrations. Yes. And I don't mean technically. I think technically I can get back to where I was, or past it. I mean the particular thing those paintings were for me. They were 3 years of learning to see a specific way, to look at a root system and see not just the structure but the story of it, the place and the season and the quality of the soil, all of that compressed into line and pigment. And that's not just skill, it's the accumulation of 10,000 hours of specific attention. I looked at the monstera at the far end of the greenhouse. I'm starting over, and starting over from 0 and starting over from 40 are different things. 0 has hope and no standard. 40 has standard, and standards aren't always useful, she said. No, but they're hard to unknow. She was quiet for a moment. The rain intensified briefly, and then eased and then settled into a steadier rhythm. A droplet found a gap in the glass above and fell directly onto a fern below, with a small, precise sound. When I came back from Copenhagen, she said, I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to build, the kind of work, the scale, the materials. I'd spent 4 years with a firm that did extraordinary things with concrete and light, and I knew, or I thought I knew, what my work was supposed to be. She held the mug in both hands. The first commission I got independently was a beach house in Connecticut. The clients wanted something specific, something I found, she paused, aesthetically incorrect, and I built what they wanted, because it was early and I needed the work, and I was good at it, and I hated it. I waited. The standard of what I knew I could do was in direct opposition to the reality of what I was doing, and for a while I thought, this is the work. This is what it means to be a professional in this field. You compromise. You do the beach house in Connecticut. You bank the money and you accept the discomfort. But you didn't keep doing that. No. She looked out at the rain. I stopped taking commissions for 2 years. People in the industry thought I was finished. I had some savings, not enough. I was frightened, if I'm honest. But I couldn't keep building things I didn't believe in. And then Iceland, she said. And something in her voice changed when she said it. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a window opens. A client who wanted something I actually wanted to make. And it turned out the thing I wanted to make was actually what the project needed. And everything after that was different. I looked at her profile. She was looking out at the rain, and the greenhouse light was falling on her in that particular way it had in the afternoon. Warm, despite everything, and there was something in her face in that moment that I had not seen before in the version of her I was relearning. Something that might have been, in someone with more available expression, wistfulness. I'm telling you this, she said, because the standard you've internalized isn't the enemy. It's what tells you when you've found the thing again. It's not what you're fighting against. It's what you're working toward. I felt something shift in my chest. Not dramatically, not the cinematic lurch that happens in stories. More like a slow tectonic adjustment, something that had been under pressure for a long time finding a fraction of release. "Zeph," I said. "That's the most I've heard you say in 11 days. She turned to look at me, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw something in her face that was entirely unguarded, and it was something I could not name, but that I felt in the back of my sternum, in a way that I immediately set aside, because now was not the time to examine it. "It rained," she said simply. "There wasn't anything else to do." But she didn't quite manage to keep the not-quite smile out of her expression, and I found myself looking at it longer than was probably advisable. The rain stopped at nightfall. We made dinner together. She made the pasta, I made the salad, a division of labor that emerged without discussion, and which meant we were moving around each other in a kitchen that was not large enough for two people to move around in without occasional proximity. She handed me things. I handed her things. At one point, she reached past me for the salt, and I was, briefly, acutely aware of the warmth of her in the air beside me. I said nothing. I stepped to the side and continued making the salad. After dinner, she stood at the east window for a long time with her arms crossed over her chest, looking at the sky. The rain had cleared it entirely, and the stars over the water were extraordinary, the way they only are when the humidity drops and the atmosphere goes transparent, and you can see the actual depth of things. "The Perseids would be better," she said, to no one in particular. "August." "I'll still be here in August," I said, and then heard myself say it. She turned from the window. Something moved across her face that I could not catch in time to identify. "I hope you will," she said. She said it evenly. She said it in the same precise register she used for everything. But there was something in the slight delay before it, a pause so small it almost wasn't a pause, that made me feel, with a certainty I had no reasonable basis for, that she meant it more than she was saying. I cleared the table. She started the coffee for the morning. The house held its cold and beautiful silence around us, and outside the stars burned over the Atlantic in their private and indifferent splendor. And I stood in the kitchen doorway watching Zephyrine Coldwater measure coffee grounds with her usual exactitude and thought, with a clarity that was almost frightening in its completeness. I am in so much trouble. Not distress, not emergency. The kind of trouble that comes from realizing too late that you have already walked some distance into a particular landscape without noticing how far you'd come. The kind you only recognize when you turn and look back and see the distance between where you are and where you thought you were standing. She looked up and caught me watching her. Neither of us said anything. The silence held all the things we hadn't said yet, which was, I was beginning to understand, quite a lot.